The big V3 update for HSR 4.4's beta has finally come out, and as usual, it has brought a hefty amount of changes to discuss for all three characters of Himeko Nova, Rin Tohsaka, and Gilgamesh. So let's jump straight into all three kits and talk about what has changed for each of them, as well as how I expect these changes to impact their performance. If you need a brief rundown of how these characters' kits work before the V3 changes, check out this video of mine for my V1 summary of their kits. Let's start with Himeko Nova, the non-collab character, the mother of the Astral Express, the main character of Plan Arcadia. I have a video dedicated to some of my more in-depth thoughts on Himeko Nova in the works, so I won't go into it too much here, but basically, I think Himeko Nova's kit was in a really good spot already, and the main thing holding her back a bit was her teammates, due to her kit incentivizing her to be played with Astral Express teammates. Her V3 update didn't really change this very much, and in fact, just pushes her even more in a certain direction. For starters, the energy cost of her ultimate went up from 140 energy to 150 energy, obviously making her more energy hungry. The damage buff from her skill went down from 30% to 20%, but that doesn't matter very much, and to be honest, it's sort of weird that this is a part of her kit to begin with. The damage multiplier of her ultimate also went up by a little bit. Mainly they just buffed the particle beam, which is the ability that you'll be spamming more during Himeko's ultimate. It's not a massive damage buff by any means, but it's something. The toughness damage of her ultimate's attacks also went up, which is really nice considering Himeko already deals toughness damage regardless of the enemy's weakness. Himeko's talent also got a slight buff, with mostly everything staying the same, except it now buffs her crit damage by 100% instead of 50%. So more crit damage for her is obviously very welcome. There's also a new line that says teammates get 10 energy when they use the assist skill, but this actually isn't anything new since this was already part of her kit, and they're just clarifying it by adding it onto her talent. And then we get to her assist skill, and this is where the bulk of Himeko's changes are, the ones that will really impact her more than any of the other things we've discussed. Her assist skill itself didn't change, so it still has the same damage multiplier and everything, but her verdict and decimation states both got buffed, and the buff for her verdict state is really nice. Prior to V3, decimation was basically just always better. This is because verdict used to only buff Himeko during her ultimate, but most of Himeko's damage actually comes from her assist skill spamming, and her ultimate is a relevant but smaller portion of her damage. Well, now the verdict state gives Himeko 100% damage bonus for completely free on all of her damage, not just ultimate damage. This instantly makes verdict feel so much better since it is now no longer killing the damage of her assist skills the way it used to. The verdict state also gives an extra 100% damage bonus to Himeko's ultimate. So the verdict state is still supposed to mainly buff Himeko's ultimate, but the fact that it is no longer only for the ultimate makes it way better. Then, Himeko's decimation state actually got nerfed in V2, cutting the crit damage buff down to 50%, but in V3, they actually buffed it up to 100%. So that's nice. I guess they realized that instead of nerfing decimation, they should just buff verdict to make it more worthwhile. However, one change that might fly under the radar is the fact that the energy from Himeko's assist skill has been changed. Instead of giving her 20 energy, it now only gives 18 energy. This is a very minor change, but given how much Himeko spams her assist skills and relies on them for energy, and given the fact that her energy cost went up, it is still a relevant change. Additionally, the assist skills in the verdict state no longer give her 4 extra energy, so they attacked her energy generation on quite a few fronts. However, this is compensated for in her first bonus ability, which now gives Himeko 5 extra energy anytime she uses the assist skill on her own turn. So let's summarize what changed about Himeko Nova's base kit. Her ultimate cost is now higher, but does more damage. Her self buffs are a lot better all around, especially in the verdict state, and she got changes to her energy generation from her assist skill. If you ask me, Himeko Nova's V3 changes are clearly pushing her synergy with Sunday. That is the main thing they are accomplishing via these changes. Messing with Himeko's energy clears Sunday shilling, making Himeko gain more energy, specifically when she uses the assist skill on her own turn, meaning she benefits more from taking turns, Sunday shill. Buffing the verdict state to make it better? Well, guess which teammate is in the cast of characters who activate the verdict state? That's right, Sunday. I'm going to go more into some of my problems with Himeko and Sunday in a separate video, but basically, even with all of these changes clearly seeming to push Himeko's synergy with Sunday, Sunday's damage buffs are just a bit too outdated. So he was never outstanding for Himeko despite having everything going for him, and I still don't expect him to be outstanding for her. However, what I think these V3 changes for Himeko are preparing us for is a Sunday Nova Flare. There have been so many rumors about Sunday getting a Nova Flare specifically for Himeko Nova, and seeing them prepare more synergy between Himeko and Sunday, despite Sunday being pretty underwhelming at the current moment, only confirms to me even further that the Sunday Nova Flare is on the horizon to make him actually definitively better as a teammate for Himeko. But that's all just speculation. Himeko still got some more relevant changes to her vertical investments, most notably her light cone. They removed the attack percent buff on her light cone, and instead, her light cone now gives 6 energy every time Himeko uses an assist skill. So this clearly pushes her her light cone even more, not just for her damage, but for her energy rotation. I always find it incredibly annoying when Hoyo does this, locking energy behind light cones like they did with Yaoguang in Evernight, but it does admittedly make her light cone even more appealing, now that it has the capability to affect her rotations and not just her damage. Lastly, the buffs from her light cone got nerfed overall, making her assist skill buff go from 75% to 72%, which is a very minor nerf obviously, you won't even feel this. And then the buff to her ultimate went from 90% down to 72% damage bonus. So overall, Himeko's light cone buffs her damage by much less, but the energy on the light cone is meant to compensate for this. As for how much it'll affect her performance, I'll have a follow-up video to this one after I've gotten personal experience with the characters and their changes. Lastly, Himeko got some nice changes to her Eidolons. Maybe. Himeko's E2 now states that it causes her ultimate and assist skill damage to become 124% of the original damage. So you can sort of think of this as being like 24% true damage, since it's a final damage multiplier increase. This is the same number as her previous E2, just worded differently. So I honestly am not sure if it's the exact same and the wording is just finally clarifying it better, or if this is a massive buff, since a 24% final damage buff is much better than just 24% damage bonus. I'm assuming the E2 stayed the same, and the wording is just much clearer now. However, her E2 now also includes her ultimate damage in this buff, whereas before it was only for her assist skills. So it is overall a buff to her E2. Lastly, Himeko's E6 got a minor buff, increasing the damage multiplier of her E6's Annihilation Pulse buff from 120% to 240%, which is essentially just double the multiplier. So that's nice. Overall, Himeko got quite a few changes that buffs her damage and self buffs, but we'll have to see how the changes to her energy, especially with and without her light cone, impacts how she feels. But again, most of her damage comes from her assist skills, and since her self buffs became higher, her assist skills are always going to be stronger now, regardless of her energy rotation. So in practice, it should just always be a buff compared to before. Now let's dive into the Fate collab characters, who also got quite a few changes. Let's begin with the limited Fate collab character, Rin Tohsaka. Rin got some numbers adjustments all across the board. Both her regular skill and her enhanced skill got their multipliers decreased. For her enhanced skill, losing 10% multiplier might not seem that crazy, but keep in mind that Rin's damage came from stacking her enhanced skill's damage. So the loss of 10% multiplier per stack will actually add up. It's still not killing her damage or main DPS playstyle by any means, but the nerf is just a bit more deceptively harsher than it might seem at first glance. Aside from nerfing her damage, Rin got her buffing capabilities for Archer nerfed by a little bit as well. Her talent's crit damage, which actually does apply to the whole team, and they finally adjusted the wording to make it more clear, got nerfed from 100% crit damage to 70% crit damage. And her first bonus ability now gives 10% res pen instead of 20% def shred, which is generally going to be worse, considering Archer teams were able to get a decent amount of defense shred, and stacking more defense shred makes the stat much stronger compared to other stats. Now, Rin is no longer a source of defense shred for Archer with just her base kit, making it harder for him to get access to more sources of defense shred. Rin's joint attack also got a small quality of life update. Essentially, going below 3 skill points is no longer the only way to trigger her joint attack. Now, Rin can trigger her joint attack when Archer launches 5 arrows, even if the skill points never fall below 3. To be clear, this was never going to be an issue for most people, because launching 5 arrows is basically always going to take you below 3 skill points. However, there were some scenarios where a mistimed Sparkle ultimate in the middle of Archer's turn, or where Sparkle's E4 and or Archer's E6 could prevent you from falling below 3 skill points, even when you use all of Archer's skills. And thus, Rin just wouldn't be able to trigger her joint attack sometimes for Archer teams at super high Eidolon investment. This change essentially just fixes that. So it's just a quality of life change for high Eidolon teams, and other than that, nothing has really changed for the joint attack. Lastly, Rin's Eidolons got some slight buffs. Her E2 now increases skill damage to 130% of the final damage instead of 110%. Again, you can think of final damage increases as being similar to true damage. So think of it as Rin now giving 30% true damage instead of only 10%. A very nice buff for sure. Then, her E4 now doubles the crit damage buff from her talent from 70% to 140%. And her E6 now gives a bit more gem energy on her ultimate. Rin's Eidolons were already fairly underwhelming as an Archer support, and these changes make them a little better, especially the E2, but they're still overall nothing special. And then there's Rin's light cone. Basically, the defense shred in Rin's base kit got moved to her light cone instead, buffing the team-wide defense shred from 10% to 20%. However, Rin no longer gives herself any bonus defense shred beyond this, and instead of 36% damage bonus, she gains 60% damage bonus for her skill. The increased defense shred is nice for buffing Archer, but otherwise, these light cone changes are nothing outstanding. Overall, Rin got nerfed pretty much all across the board without much compensation. Luckily, the nerfs aren't too punishing, just minor number adjustments, nerfing her own damage, and nerfing some of the buffs she's providing to herself and Archer. But she's still offering Archer a lot, and since Archer is already strong enough even without Rin, he basically guarantees Rin will still have a relevant spot in the meta on her release, even with these nerfs to her kit. And last but not least, we have to talk about the King of Heroes himself, Gilgamesh, our free collab character. Going into this V3 update, Gilgamesh was the one who I was expecting the most changes for, and I was definitely not wrong about that. Let's start with the really big change, the one that needed to happen, the nerf to Gilgamesh's joint attack with Saber, aka the nerf to Saber specifically. Prior to V3, Gilgamesh and Saber definitely felt way too strong in my opinion, mostly due to this joint attack, allowing Saber to loop her ultimates and turns to a ridiculous degree. These changes clearly aimed to target that loop. The joint attack now no longer grants Saber a 25% action advance, and the energy was reduced from 200 to 120, which is going to mostly be fine in practice, since Saber was overcapping on energy by a lot with the 200 energy anyway. However, the largest nerf to this joint attack was the fact that it now requires 8 attacks between Saber and Gilgamesh to trigger the joint attack instead of only 3 attacks from Saber herself. So they didn't really put a cap on the joint attack, but they just made it much more difficult to trigger. 8 attacks might seem like a lot, but keep in mind, Saber tends to attack in waves of 3 hits. She does an enhanced basic attack to reset her talent, and if she has enough energy to action advance, which she usually does, then she will instantly action advance and use her free skill into an ultimate. That's 3 hits back to back to back, which is why the 3-hit rule for the old joint attack was so perfect and easily exploitable by Saber. Now that the new requirement is 8 hits, you essentially need to do Saber's 3-hit combo twice to reach 6 hits, and then as long as Gilgamesh does 2 hits in between those turns with his skill and ultimate, or maybe even with 2 skills if he gets 2 action advances from interest stacks, then that perfectly reaches 8 hits. Essentially, instead of Saber triggering the joint attack every rotation where she does 3 hits, she now needs 2 rotations of 3 hits in order to trigger the joint attack. So she's now only triggering the joint attack every other turn of hers. But don't worry, they did compensate for this in some way. The joint attack now causes Saber's next ultimate to deal 200% of its original damage, which is literally doubling its final damage. Or, going with the true damage comparison again, it essentially gives 100% true damage to Saber's next ultimate. However, again, due to the trigger requirement for the joint attack, she'll only be getting this every other ultimate. So it's not as crazy as it sounds, but the nerf to the joint attack also isn't as doomed as it sounds either. In short, I actually think Hoyo did a really good job of balancing the joint attack, nerfing it from how crazy it used to be and how easy it was to constantly trigger it back to back, but compensating for it by making the raw damage numbers for Saber and Gilgamesh really high. In my eyes, they essentially wanted to remove what made the joint attack broken from a mechanical standpoint, while still keeping Saber and Gilgamesh's damage relatively high, and I think they accomplished it really well. But of course, the changes to the joint attack aren't the only thing that changed for Gilgamesh. Let's start with the positives. Damage. Big damage. Gilgamesh got his damage numbers massively buffed all across the board. His skill multiplier went up, and his ultimate's damage multiplier got giga buffed, going from 800% total multiplier previously to now being a whopping 1400% multiplier. They nearly doubled the damage multiplier of his ultimate, which is just crazy to me. On top of this, they massively lowered his energy cost from 600 all the way down to 360. All of this combined is going to make him much more viable as a main DPS, separate from Saber, compared to before, which I know is what a lot of people were hoping for. Honestly, that damage buff on his ultimate is pretty absurd, and I'm still a little shocked by it, but moving on to the rest of his changes, Gilgamesh's first bonus ability now changed some of the way he gets interest stacks, which are the stacks required for his self-action advance. He gets slightly less interest stacks when allies use their ultimates, but he now gains interest stacks when he uses his own ultimate as well. We'll have to see if this ends up balancing out. More importantly, the energy he gets when other allies use their ultimates was massively nerfed, but this is mainly just to balance out the fact that his ultimate's energy cost was also reduced by almost half. Still, he is getting significantly less energy from allies now, but his own skill's energy is now going to be much more relevant for his energy rotation as compared to before, and taking more turns by gaining more interest stacks from his ultimate will hopefully help him take more turns to use more skills for more energy. The main thing being accomplished by nerfing Gil's energy gain though is the nerf to his crazy synergy with Remembrance Trailblazer. Since RMC gains Mem Charge every time allies gain energy, Gilgamesh and Saber were capable of supercharging Mem with the amount of energy they're feeding into each other. Now that the amount of energy generation going on in a Saber and a Gilgamesh team is much smaller, the synergy with Mem should be a bit more under control now. Although I'm sure RMC will still be a great option for the team. It just won't feel quite as broken as it did before, which, in my opinion, I definitely think the RMC synergy very much needed some nerfs. So Hoyo did a pretty good job with this one. To be clear, it's not that I wanted Gilgamesh and Saber to be bad. Saber deserves to have her massive upscale, and Gilgamesh is still going to give her that. But Gil and Saber prior to V3 were just so massively overtuned to a degree that most players won't be able to comprehend since they were never able to experience it. So just trust me when I say that a lot of these nerfs were very well deserved. And, well, these actually aren't even the last of Gil's nerfs. His second bonus ability also got nerfed, now requiring a higher energy cost for teammates to get the full buff from his attack and crit damage buff. The full buff also got nerfed overall, from a total of 130% attack and crit damage to now giving 90% attack and crit damage total. Then, in his third bonus ability, they removed Gilgamesh's ability to overflow on energy for some reason, which honestly is going to make some of his energy generation feel clunky, but it is what it is. To compensate, his self-crit damage buff went up from a total of 120% to 150%, so that makes up for the crit damage he lost in his second bonus ability, for himself at least. Lastly, Gilgamesh's Eidolons got some slight buffs. His E1 now gives him 60% attack instead of 25%, which is nice. His E1 is also even better than before, since they lowered his energy cost from 600 to 360, but they kept the energy on his E1 at a fixed 60 energy still, so it's filling up a larger portion of his energy compared to when his max energy cost was much higher. Honestly, Gil's E1 has always been pretty decent with the team-wide defense strat and self-buffs and energy, and it's definitely even better now than before. His E2 lost some of its interest stack generation, but the additional damage multiplier that it adds to its ultimate got higher, so that's a trade-off I think most people will be happy with, especially since his base kit now gives him interest stacks when he uses his ultimate anyway, even without his E2, so it's effectively unchanged. As for his E6, Gil's ultimate damage multiplier got buffed a bit, but the requirement to get his instant ult refill from his E6 got changed to require 6 ally ultimates instead of 5, which is probably a healthy way to balance the crazy ultimate looping that could potentially still happen with E6 Saber and E6 Gilgamesh. As for his light cone, not much changed. The damage percent buff for his own ultimate essentially got buffed from 60% to 72%, while the team-wide crit damage buff got nerfed from 25% to 24%. Yeah, very crazy nerf there. I know. That 1% crit damage is really gonna change everything. Totally. Honestly, I don't know why they even bothered, but maybe they just like the number 24 more than the number 25. Anyway, overall, Gilgamesh's synergy with Saber was definitely the main target of his nerfs, reducing his team-wide buffs in his base kit, as well as nerfing the joint attack. Sure, the joint attack now gives Saber a massively enhanced ultimate every time it triggers, but triggering the joint attack is harder now, and the loss of energy and action advance aims to target some of the ridiculous turn looping they were capable of prior to these changes. I personally think these are really healthy changes to how unbalanced the Gilgamesh and Saber duo felt before. In contrast, Gilgamesh got massively buffed for his teams without Saber. Reducing his energy cost makes it way more manageable when playing him in non-Saber teams, like with Blade and Ashvale or Tribby, since even though Gilgamesh is getting way less energy from their ultimates now, his own skill and his own turns are at least contributing to his own energy a lot more compared to before. And obviously, Gilgamesh's personal damage got super buffed, nearly doubling the multiplier of his ultimate. While the loss of some of his team-wide buffing will hurt the Blade and Ashvale team, Gilgamesh still mostly kept all of his self-buffs to his own damage, so I think the main goal of Gilgamesh's V3 was to reel in the Gilgamesh and Saber synergy, still keeping that team very strong, while also making Gilgamesh able to stand on his own without Saber a little bit better, and they accomplished that really well. That's my general sentiment for this V3 beta update in general, not just for Gilgamesh, but for all the characters. All of the changes make a lot of sense if you assume that they wanted to tune down both Saber and Archer's performances by nerfing Rin and Gilgamesh, and Himeko's changes seem geared towards setting her up for a team with Sunday whenever he gets a Nova Flare to be more worth the team slot, while keeping Himeko in the powerful state that she's currently in, even without needing Sunday. I think they accomplished all of this, including the nerfs to Saber and Archer's teams, in really healthy and balanced ways, honestly, while also buffing up Gilgamesh as a standalone DPS, apart from Saber, which is really nice, given that he's a free character. I'm just really happy with these V3 changes, even with the nerfs. But what do you think about this V3 update, and the plethora of changes that all of the characters went through? Are you excited for any of the buffs to Himeko and Gilgamesh, or were some of the nerfs to the Archer and Saber teams, as well as the energy changes for Himeko, too much in your opinion? Let me know in the comments below, and like the video if you found it helpful or enjoyable at all. I'll have another video coming shortly after this one, with my more in-depth thoughts on the characters' performances, once I've actually gotten to try them out, as well as pulling advice for each of them, so be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on that. Thank you so much for watching, and with all of that said, until next time!